Hey, welcome to the Rhino podcast. So do you ever feel like screaming out in the office, on Zoom or outside the school gates? For the love of God, come on, really? Then if this is you and you're looking for an honest, fun and frank podcast on life and business, then sit back and listen to me, Rhino Morel. I'll be bringing great people on the show to talk, share and debate their life experiences and business challenges, keeping the show unpolished, but in a fun and unique British style, with sarcasm, tenacity, or maybe a few swear words or tears. This podcast keeps it real, honest, raw, and removes the bullshit in the only way I know how, through authenticity and getting shit done. Think of it less like the Housewives of New York or Towie with the lipo and drama, and more like the house lives of the real world. I hope you'll take something away to be better informed, laugh, smile, or maybe even finally getting the confidence to shout, come on really. So enjoy. Hi Charlie, welcome to the Rhino Morale podcast. How are you?
Very well indeed. Thank you very much. And, thank you. I'm very honoured to be included in this podcast.
Oh, no, I think the honour is absolutely all mine. Stunning photography you've got behind you there. And I wanted to introduce you to the listeners. This is Charlie Mayhew, who is the co-founder and CEO of Tusk, which I am pretty confident most of you will know about due to Charlie's success. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about Charlie's journey as well. So take you back just a couple of years. But Charlie did his education at Wellington College, and then you then spent a couple of years traveling around Switzerland, South Africa, Australia, and after returning home, you went into finance, which is an interesting area. And I also believe you did a bit of moonlighting as a DJ. Yes. Okay. I might touch on that again a bit later. See if you're still doing that.
Many moons ago.
But in 1985, actually, you set up the really successful Young Europe Africa expedition, and that saw 33 people start off and travel across the Sahara through the Congo, and kind of finishing up in Cape Town. That was filmed by Channel 4. That's right, isn't it? As a documentary on conservation and community projects. And on your return after that 7-month journey, you were elected as a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. You then went back into finance again for a little bit, but this is where you really are today. And in 1990 is when you co-founded the charity, which I didn't realize it was that long. And as part of this, you co-produced the film Lost in Africa to really drive that awareness around the ivory trade. And clearly, under your stewardship and your leadership, the business is what it is now, as an exceptionally well-known, successful UK NGO. And we know we have the Duke of Cambridge as one of your patrons. And in 2005, you were awarded a well-deserved MBE. So the honour is all mine. Thank you for joining us. Firstly, I'd love you to talk about what the main issues are really now for Tusk, be that climate, be that people pressure, ivory trade. Where are you as an organisation?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Rhino. So I think it's interesting if one turns the clock back to when I founded the charity in 1990. In those days, there was probably more of a sort of fortress mentality to conservation, and it was really about putting up fences and trying to protect, species such as rhino and elephant that were under significant threat, and continue to be so today. But there's been a very significant shift over the last 30 years that has really seen a movement to engage local communities into conservation, because so much of the African landscape where wildlife exists is outside national parks. And so the future of that wildlife and that biodiversity really depends on the relationship, the successful relationship and coexistence of communities with that wildlife, and allowing them to derive a benefit and to see the value of that natural heritage that they've got. We've been working a lot in most of our projects have a very strong human dimension to them, and also
Right.
a community element. But what we've seen that with the growing human population across the continent, which is set to double, over the next couple of decades, terrifyingly from 1.2 billion to 2.4 billion across Africa. That is inevitably going to lead to increased human-wildlife conflict and loss of habitat.
Yeah.
And so, whilst the conservation world has probably been preoccupied in the last 5 to 10 years with the poaching crisis and the illegal wildlife trade, which I'm sure we can talk about as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Probably the biggest train coming down the track is this loss of habitat because of the human footprint and the conflict that is going to bring wildlife and humans into as that rolls out. So those are the big challenges that we see, and I think an overarching challenge, of course, is climate change, and the increasing urbanization of the human population, and I see that across the globe, not just in Africa. I think that very sadly, the human species is becoming more and more disconnected from the natural world, and less appreciating the huge value it has to our health and well-being. And actually the pandemic perhaps has highlighted that.
Yeah, I guess when I hear you talk, I think, I'm trying to do couch to 5K, and just this morning, hearing the birds, doing that run really early, I came home and said to Nick, it's so nice just to get out there, and I do have hope that COVID has reconnected people with priorities, because everyone you speak to who spends time in nature, and I have travelled Africa, I have been to the Mara, South Africa and Uganda, etc. It's just sheer happiness and contentment and peaceful, and I don't see many people who disagree with that, but it's like, how do you get from 1.2 billion to 2.5 and find a solution to that? How are you driving the hope in that angle?
It is a big challenge, and I've always said, I mean, a number of people over the years have said to me, how do you remain so positive when the stats are just so negative? And I've always said, you've actually got to be. I believe you've got to be an eternal optimist, to sort of keep driving through. And I do see a number. I mean, through Tusk, we have some amazing project partners doing incredible work and having a real impact. And so that gives you the energy and the hope that we can make things better. I think that it is increasingly difficult, and that we as a species, a human species, take nature for granted, and the pandemic has really highlighted that through man's interference in nature, we've encouraged these zoonotic diseases to leap and transfer from wildlife world into the human world, and we've got to wake up to this. And I think that my hope is that this last year of the pandemic has made many more people wake up to the reality that we've really got to start looking after the natural world. It's not just a nice to have, it's not just a luxury, it's essential.
A lifeline.
It's a lifeline. Every David Attenborough had a wonderful sort of saying that every breath of air we breathe and every mouthful of food we take is dependent on the natural world. you know, and he's right. It's we're such an arrogant species, and we're so all dominant and all powerful that we just forget that fundamental issue that we are ultimately our own life and well-being is dependent on the natural world. Of course, this year we've got the global COP on biodiversity in Congo, and we've got, of course, the big one, which is the COP26 in Glasgow in November. And so, again, it's sort of been dubbed the sort of super year for conservation. It was meant to be in last year, of course.
Of course.
I'm actually quite pleased it's this year.
Yes, you've had more time for it to brew and generate.
Correct. And dare I say, one of the world leaders on the stage has come off the stage, and of course was highly skeptic on climate change. So we've had a significant shift in the White House, which I hope is going to be really helpful in terms of the COP26.
And actually, it's an interesting point. Sometimes I'm doing quite a bit in kind of the climate change environment, and it is easy to feel very overwhelmed and get bogged down in that. And like you say, sometimes you've just got to have that absolute crazy optimism and keep going with that passion. And if you can leave a legacy of the next generation, and as you talk about the communities, they will take on that journey and it will build and build. I was reading this morning that Tusks are working on, vaccinating the dogs. And because people are so close to the wildlife, the need to keep the dogs vaccinated so that they're not passing, you talk about cross contamination between people and diseases. Likewise, you're doing that work in the community with the dogs and the animals.
Yes, absolutely. And that's specifically really to try and contain rabies. And it's and I've been on one of those sort of vaccination missions in the Serengeti, and it's it's amazing how many domestic dogs they're sort of pretty feral, as you would imagine. And so it's so easy for them to connect with wildlife, and particularly with the wild dog population and other predators. And it's exactly how these sort of diseases can transmit and cross over. So that's an important and that particular project has been hugely effective and successful in containing rabies there.
And I think it's kind of ironic. I know last night I was watching the news about, and again this morning, that India is declaring we have no oxygen. We literally, in a few hours, we have no oxygen to treat people. And I turned and looked at my husband and went, how ironic that is, that we are in this disaster and the one thing we need is oxygen. And so I wonder if, that arrogance of the human will be reminded of the importance of how, the earth, the animals, the trees, everything has such an important role to a basic fundamental that we take for granted.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everything's interconnected, and we forget that at our peril. And I think it's, the trouble is that when you're looking at the developing world, and Africa in particular, in our case, is that you have to remember that for so many people across Africa, life is about surviving from one day to the next and putting food on the table. One of the things we've seen from the pandemic across Africa has been, because their economies have been so hard hit by the pandemic, the fact that tourism fell off a cliff, it's probably going to take a while to come back. So many people lost their jobs and their livelihoods, that African countries, by and large, do not have a social security system, a safety net that is just going to come in and provide a wonderful furlough system and unemployment benefits or anything else. There isn't that. They just don't have those resources, and I think it's, again, easy for us in the West to forget that. So what that has meant, and what we've seen, is that there's been a spike in bushmeat poaching.
Yes.
This is not for trade per se.
To live.
This is to live, and are cutting down of trees for charcoal because they just don't have the wherewithal to go and support their families. So so we've seen a significant pressure building from that.
And have you found that you're right? I think as a Westerner, you can often look at the beautiful pictures of the Mara in Cape Town and just think, oh, these people, they're so lucky they've got all this wildlife. But like, I don't often. It just feels so unfair that whenever there's something to do with climate change or something like COVID, it hits the people who have nothing the hardest every single time. And it's, how do we wake up as the kind of Western world and kind of go, do you know what, this just can't continue. This is on every moral level of being a decent human being. These people are literally starving and dying to death. And of course, they're going to turn to wildlife and trees. So if somebody offers, a poacher or somebody thousands, hundreds of pounds for that tiny bit of tusk, you're going to take it, aren't you?
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, the illegal wildlife trade, which is something which we've worked on for many years through our partnership, and also because our patron Prince William has been very vocal on this, really leading the charge on trying to tackle the illegal wildlife trade on various different levels. And I was lucky enough to be invited to join him on a trip to China, where he was able to engage with President Xi directly, face to face, on this, and it was I think it was one of those sort of moments where the people were slightly holding their breath as to how that would go down. But it actually, it went really well, and subsequently I know that he wouldn't claim to have persuaded President Xi alone, because there was a lot of pressure on China. But there's no doubt in my mind that, and indeed other people in the conservation world, that Prince William's efforts in this space has really had a huge impact, and ultimately led to China, introducing a domestic ban on the trade in ivory. That was something that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, none of us would have believed was really possible.
No. And so
these things are possible, to change mindsets and to move the dial, and so that's another reason why we must never give up.
No, absolutely. I'd like to touch back on that, but for people who, the kind of the myths, and we hear that effectively tusks, horns are the same as your fingernails. I've always been a believer of keeping traditions and cultures, but why is it that, I know that this is so deep in the history and of Asia, but it's a very rich nation with lots of extremely intelligent and well-off people. What's driving this desire and demand for something that ultimately is hair and nails?
Yeah, so an important thing is to separate ivory from rhino horn. So you're absolutely right. Rhino horn is made of keratin. It's basically matted hair, and it's like your fingernail. And that product is traditionally used in Chinese medicine in various forms. But what's happened with rhino horn is that the price of rhino horn has escalated to such ridiculous levels of up to $50,000-$60,000 a kilo, making it more valuable than gold. Is that it's moved from being just something from a traditional Chinese medicine property to something which is a status symbol. So what happens is that people they might celebrate a major occasion or a big business deal by presenting a rhino horn, because it's all about status. So that's the
Wow.
problem with rhino horn is because it's actually consumed, as opposed to ivory, which is purely an artifact.
Yeah.
Elephant ivory is purely an artifact, basically. So and a few years ago, what was really upsetting was that some reported official in the Far East claimed that he'd been cured of cancer by taking rhino horn. Now,
Oh,
it's been proved over and over again there is no medicinal property
yeah.
in rhino horn. As I say, it's like biting your fingernail. So, but it's, once that sort of message goes out there, if you are someone who's got a relative who's got cancer and everything has failed, and someone said, well, why don't you, I heard that rhino horn might work, you're going to
do anything you could to get your hands on it. Yeah.
So that's a huge concern. The ivory trade, as I say, is very different. It is status a symbol again.
Yeah.
But fortunately, since China introduced its ivory ban, the price of ivory has dropped dramatically. China was probably responsible for 80% of ivory. We still have a problem with countries like Japan and other Far Eastern nations, Indonesia and whatever, where ivory is still being traded.
Right.
But taking China out of the picture, not wholly, because inevitably, China's borders are porous and there's corruption there and it's still leaking in. But the great thing about China is that this has come from right on high, from Xi himself. And so and the penalties can be quite severe. So I think people know that you are taking quite a big risk actually if you trade in ivory there.
And so I was going to say, kind of, we often, having someone like you and Prince William is incredible, but it feels like we need the equivalent of someone in, like you say, in China who is the patron, and in Africa who is the patron. Do you have people like that?
Yeah, so in China, this is not they're not ambassadors for Tusk, but because actually there are a number of organizations who are really proactive in this space. Wild Aid in particular is one, and they've managed to bring together a number of sort of very well-known Chinese figures, including Yao Ming, who's that sort of 7 foot tall basketball player.
Yeah.
Who I've met actually, and he's passionate about this, and then Jackie Chan, the actor who I also met in London once, and in fact, it was very funny that all of the waiters and waitresses were coming up throughout dinner to get his signature, his autograph.
Amazing.
So they've managed to get together quite a few high-profile people, and there's been quite a big public campaign, poster campaign around the airports and things like that. So we've definitely seen that movement.
Yeah. And so when you touched on earlier about ivory, saying obviously we now have this kind of import ban, you said the price had dropped drastically, but has it had an impact on in the field and elephants being killed?
Yeah, so the signs, the early signs of the introduction of the ivory ban of China are pretty positive, and in some countries the elephant populations are already beginning to recover, and for instance, Kenya has had very, very few elephant losses due to poaching in the last couple of years. There is still poaching in certain places, and we absolutely can't be complacent and take it off the accelerator. Particularly down in southern Africa, poaching is still bad there, and in places like Central Africa and the Congo, and so ivory is still being found and confiscated from poachers. But the interesting enough, the pandemic has probably also helped to quash it, because the illegal wildlife trade is run by international organized criminal syndicates.
Yeah.
Let's be under no doubt about that. These are the same people who are trading arms, drugs, human trafficking, whatever. For them, it's just purely about profit. And so, but because of the pandemic, it's been so much more difficult to move the contraband, the product, around, and to try and export it and get it off, to the Far East.
It's bizarre in a way, because for everything we want COVID to obviously disappear, maybe someone in my mindset sees so many more positives that have come from this situation, the realization, the climate change, the fact that even silly things like the number of people on the streets and crime, there's just this huge benefits, that, like, I look at the story that you talk about with the rhino horn, and it kind of makes me want to go a bit innovative and think, why don't we set up like some sort of fake rhino horn, infiltrate and kind of sell this thing as if it is, and I don't know.
It's interesting you say that, because there are two schools of thought, and in certain parts of Southern Africa, they have been pressing the idea of, or wanting to promote the idea of opening up the trade in rhino horn and basically farming it, because a rhino horn grows continuously through the animal's life. So you can cut the horn off and it will grow back slowly, but it will grow back. So there are people, particularly in South Africa, there's a particular guy called John Hume, who basically sort of, has placed a bet by accumulating rhinos and harvesting the horn in the hope that one day the market would open up. The trouble is that the population of rhino is still very, very low. So you've got, there are about 5,000 to 6,000 black rhino left in the wild today, and perhaps about 20,000 to 22,000 white rhino left.
Right.
If you were to take the horns off all of those animals, and sort of flood the market, okay, the price of rhino horn would certainly fall. But what you're also doing is you're then stimulating a market and saying, this is fine to consume, and it's actually it's a con, because it has no property, it has no medicinal property. So why fuel that flame, in my mind? But more importantly, what you'll do is that you stimulate the demand to the point that you then can't meet that demand.
Yeah, because I guess once you cut off a rhino horn, albeit like your nails grow, it's going to take some time to get it to a point.
Yeah, exactly. And so you then get to a situation where you've stimulated the demand, and therefore you actually again stimulate a black market and an illegal trade in it, because people will be so desperate to get hold of it. But what one's also forgetting is that the rhino has a horn for a reason, and so because if you're rhinos fight, and they use their horn to defend themselves. They use their horn to defend their young from an attack by lions or whatever. So again, it's just an extraordinary arrogance of man to think we can harvest a rhino horn and use it without having any impact on that species.
And it's a really cruel thing to do, isn't it? To take away an animal's defense, effectively, and confidence and strength to, like you say, fight, mate, protect. And I mean, obviously I wouldn't want to see it in version 1 or version 2, but I guess there's got to be something that looks a bit like with climate change. Like, how do we get, I see where that guy's going. It's like, how could we make it sustainable? But ultimately, there's not enough of them. They don't grow that quickly. And like you say, you're just stimulating the market and saying it's okay to do it, and it's not.
Yeah, no, exactly. And what he's done, I mean, he's now sort of running out of money, actually, because the bet's gone against him. But is that he's effectively been farming them like cows. So you go to his property, and he's got them, in these large paddocks, if you like, with water troughs. They're not natural. They're not.
Oh God!
These are not this is not livestock. And actually, what interestingly, one of the problems that he's had is that it's encouraged his population of rhino to suffer from various diseases because they're being unnaturally
close
and close. Yeah.
So when he runs out of money, and let's hope he does, is somebody like Tusk ready to pounce? And are we able to, I say we, like I work there, are you able to take those animals then and help them? Like if he went bust, what would happen to all those animals?
Well, I think that he's already. I haven't had a recent report on it, but I did hear that he was trying to sell or trying to find another investor to come in behind him, so we shall see. But his situation is totally unnatural. Those rhinos really ought to be, redispersed into wild areas.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been on the end of a charging female rhino protecting her young, and it is it's pretty scary. But actually, you know what? I think it's like you want to transport every Westerner into Africa to experience the joys of what that is, and there's nothing like being charged at by a rhino to make you feel so completely insignificantly small and powerless. And I think that's the biggest fear of the human race, the over arrogance of the human race, that we know we can shoot it, we can, we spread diseases, we have control. But when and I often think about that with my children, it's like, it's not about traveling to go on holiday. I want them to sit in a vehicle surrounded by lions or animals and feel scared, but feel, overwhelmed by the natural world. I mean, you've got some stunning pictures behind you there. How, have you got any kind of, what has been your closest call yourself in the kind of wild world? You must have had a few.
Well, actually, a rhino, actually. Probably, I've had a couple of rhino moments being charged by rhino, and both times on foot,
Right.
opposed to, and it gets the heart racing. I always sort of, the one thing I love about Africa, apart from its people and cultures and landscape, is I never feel more alive than I do when I'm in Africa. All your senses are just really, they have to be pretty attuned, particularly if you're walking through the bush. You've got to be very aware. No, I've had a couple of moments where and interesting enough, we were with, on one occasion was with a couple of rangers, and we were told what we should do if the rhino charged, and the rhino did charge, and none of us did what we were told. we all literally just bombshelled, and it was every man for himself.
Well, thank God you made it out alive.
No, it was cool. It was fine, but yeah.
Well, that's that fight or flight thing. Actually, it's funny because my husband and I did a walk in the Mara, but we were on the kind of edge of the Mara, so they were like, "You're not really going to get lions and whatever." But we were with 4 rangers, Maasai gentlemen, and there was a vehicle kind of following in the background. So anyway, walking along, and I'm going, looking at the footprints. Are you sure there's no, lions and elephants? No. Anyway, we hear the most horrendous noise in the bush to the right hand side of us, and the guy up ahead with my husband is fine. I can see him tapping my husband on the shoulder, and they just start to walk in the opposite direction. I turn to look at the guy with me, the Maasai guy. He's pegged it. He has literally legged it off to the van, and I'm going, I'm not going to swear, but I'm on my own in the bush. Anyway, we got into the van. He was hugely apologetic, and I renamed him Maasai Warrior, and he pulled up his dressage, and he'd been attacked by a lion, and I just went, you might want to think about a career change. I'm not sure you should be doing these bushwalks, but again, what a way to feel alive.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's a very, very special place, and I feel very privileged that I've had the chance to travel, the length and breadth of the continent, and it's very and such incredible diversity and variety of landscapes, and whether it be the forests of the Congo to the deserts of Namibia or Sahara or whatever. It's an amazing continent. I certainly urge people to go and visit, because it's and I'm very conscious that we all need to be aware of our own carbon footprint in traveling, but Africa's economies and its future is also so dependent on us visiting and supporting their economies. Country like Kenya, it's tourism is responsible for employing, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people,
Yeah.
and it represents something like 12 to 15% of GDP. It's very, very significant, and if we don't put a value on tourism, and it's got to be responsible tourism, I hasten to add, but then it's going to be so much more difficult to save and look after and preserve these incredible places.
And it's like you said earlier, the need to focus on the animal, be it the rhino, the lion, the elephant. Actually, it does need to be holistic within the community. And I think encouraging people to get on planes and fly, in the bigger scheme, there are plenty of ways that you could offset that carbon. And I think if we could encourage more people to embrace the people of Africa, wherever I've been, have just left me gobsmacked in their kindness, in their ability to do things, and have very little. And I've been in townships in South Africa, and been with the pygmies in Uganda, and I like you, I would massively encourage people to when we can embrace the African culture. But bringing it back to Tusk, and obviously the challenges. So we know we've got this big roadblock kind of coming at us, or the train as you describe it. How have you seen an impact recently with COVID on the kind of the hunting element, not for exporting, but the sport as it's defined?
So in terms of interesting enough, pre-COVID even, there were already signs that the trophy hunting was sort of beginning to decline in a number of places, which was interesting. Certainly through COVID, there has been virtually no trophy hunting because, like tourism, it's just fallen off the cliff. Trophy hunting is a very complex debate, and is often oversimplified. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend trophy hunting per se. We don't support it as an organization. However, what is really important to understand is that if we did away with trophy hunting overnight, that would have a very significant impact on the protection of some very significant and very valuable wildlife landscape.
Right.
And if I could explain that a little bit more, is that where trophy hunting exists at the moment, those hunters pay a concession fee. They pay either into the communities or to government, and they take over that piece of land. There is a quota system that supposedly works to control the number of species that they're allowed to offtake. That in itself often leads to corruption and an abuse of the system. It's not properly regulated. There are all sorts of issues and problems around it. But the bottom line is that, and the thing that I'm most concerned about is the land itself, the habitat.
Right.
Because if hunting was done away with without really thinking through the consequences and having an alternative put in place to ensure that that piece of land is still going to be preserved for wildlife, then we are in danger of letting very large tracts of land, very valuable wildlife habitat, often that sits around national parks and acts as a sort of a buffer zone and
Yeah.
in some cases the lungs of those national parks to allow the animals to migrate in and out. That land could be turned over to settlement, cultivation, agriculture.
Yeah.
And once it's lost forever. So we have to find alternatives to trophy hunting, which is going to make sure that that land is protected. And the problem is that there isn't the resources, the finance available from either from the philanthropic world, the NGO
Yeah.
world, or governments to say, that's all right, we'll just put it into the national park or whatever. That's not going to happen.
No.
So we have to find a way of generating alternative revenue that will replace trophy hunting and ensure that we can still hang on to these very valuable bits of wildlife habitat.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, one area that has really come to the fore through the pandemic has been the revenue that can come from carbon offsetting.
Yes.
And so that's quite exciting potentially. The carbon offset market itself has got, some reputational risks involved. It's not straightforward. It's not, it's not the silver bullet that's going to solve everything. But certainly we've seen in places like Zambia a really exciting initiative, which has now generated really substantial revenue from carbon offsetting for communities in areas which traditionally they've had trophy hunting.
Yeah.
And through the pandemic, they've seen this revenue sustained, whereas all their tourism and trophy hunting revenue has disappeared.
Gone.
So it's,
they're going to put more effort and realize, yeah. And you know what, that's really interesting. I'll certainly take that forward in the work that we're doing with ARC 2030, because as part of that kind of climate change target for 2030, carbon credits is a huge thing, past credits, future credits. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting one to watch. And I think the value of those carbon credits as it gets tighter, more restricted, certified and governed will drive the value of those carbon credits going forward. Listen, I'd love to know, what are the top 1 or 2 things that you'd love to let the listeners know, for anyone who's out there listening going, but what can I do? It's very easy to drop a £5 a month or whatever, but what can individuals do? And for any organization, what's your biggest ask right now?
You won't be surprised to say that, to hear me say money is the biggest ask. We, last year, the pandemic, we launched an initiative called the Wildlife Ranger Challenge and secured over $10 million specifically as an emergency response to the fact that so many rangers were being put out of work or having their salaries cut by up to 80%. So through that initiative alone, and it was the money that did it, and we were very lucky to secure the support of a philanthropist who put up a $5 million match fund. So we unlocked that dollar for dollar. But what that did was that we've managed to support over 10,000 rangers, kept them on the front line of conservation throughout this pandemic.
Well, that's your charity furlough then, I guess.
Yeah, in a way.
Basically.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it is. But so unfortunately, money is the big ask. Having said that, once we're allowed to travel again responsibly, I would urge people to get back to Africa. They desperately need our income and revenue in order to support their livelihoods and to put this value back on their natural heritage. So that's important. And then on the illegal wildlife trade, when you travel to other parts of the world, just be really mindful that you're not inadvertently buying a piece of ivory or some product that is being fobbed off on you as being totally legal and so that's important as well.
Right.
And then above all, I think let us all really understand the value of the natural world, even in our own homes and our own environments. And we've got to put a value on natural capital.
Yeah.
Natural and social capital, we have to understand. We take so much of this for granted, and we extract so much from the earth that we've just done for free. We haven't put a value on it, and that's got to change.
Yeah, I just wish there was a way that Mother Earth could act like, the Silicon Valley or the bank and go, time's up, you owe me plus interest.
Yes.
So listen, Charlie, thank you so much for joining me today. I've learned a ton of stuff, and I hope that everybody has. I think you've hit on some key subjects there around the conservation, illegal wildlife, and climate change. So thank you so much. I wish you well with all of the success with Tusk, and I hope to obviously keep in touch with you. So thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Rhino. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So that's it. You've made it. The show's over. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to take something away, maybe solve a problem, or just know you're not alone. Here's hoping it made you smile with a few laughs along the way. Please feel free to find me on all social media channels, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search the Rhino Morale Podcast. Have an awesome day, and see you next time.